Okay, continuing the theme
Okay.
that we've been covering here. Additional principles. Now, Pasik Resha. Damon and Gavin, I don't know if Arthur may not have heard of it. So Pasik Resha is if one intends to do a permitted activity which inevitably will result in a malacha, then the activity becomes forbidden. Even though one is not normally liable for an unintended malacha, any intended permitted activity which will certainly, almost certainly result in malacha is prohibited. For example, washing hands is a permitted act. Washing hands over grass is not, since the inevitable consequence of the permitted activity is forbidden. That would be watering the grass. Okay, now we have something called causation, which is called grammar. Actually, the word causation, grammar, which we've covered recently and discussed recently. So English is called causation. An act which results in a malacha indirectly might be so remote from it as to render it permissible. Such leniency normally occurs in situations where there's a real risk of loss or for the benefit of a sick person. For example, one may prevent the spread of fire by pouring water around it, but not on the flames. On occasions, there is uncertainty as to whether the effect of the cause may even happen. For example, opening a door is permitted even though one may cause a change of temperature in the room, which might lead to a thermostat activating a heating system. Okay, let's leave it at that and continue tomorrow.
Okay.
Grammar, so yeah. And then we're nearly done. Actually, she said the last two are tomorrow, then we actually finish the book.
Yeah, so the only thing I don't understand is you're allowed to walk on the grass when it's a high probability of killing insects when you're walking on, which would be prohibited to kill insects.
Okay, but the thing, can I say, can I answer that?
But it's not your intent to kill the insects, I get that.
If you don't see them, like if there's an insect in food and it's microscopic and you don't see it, if you eat it by mistake, unintentionally, which it obviously is, it's permitted. If you cannot see it with the naked eye, you can't see any movement or any creatures there, and you happen to eat a microscopic creature, it's the same thing as walking on the grass there. If you see an ant, you can't stand.
How do you explain that for preparing lettuce, you have to examine every second, but when you're in the grass...
Yeah. I know, but you're not going to look down on the...
No, but I'm saying it's the same thing. You could say,
no, sure.
the lettuce is fine. You don't have to sit there with a microscope, and yet and there's a different rule book for the consumption compared to if you're killing water. It's weird. But you're right, Kev. I just don't understand. You're right. You've got a good point. I just don't know what to do.
That could be a chok.
Yeah. It's certainly a squish, but it's certainly a chok. I'm going to share my screen just to review the Mishnah with you guys. We'll show you where we're at. Okay, so all we've done so far is that the Mishnah defines the degree at which one must supervise his sheep to prevent it from damaging another's property. Okay, so far all we did was discuss what do we mean lock the gate properly up until this point. That's all we dealt with. Now we're talking about if a fold was breached at night or robbers breached it and the sheep escaped and damaged, he is not liable. But if robbers took it out, the robbers are liable. And then if he left the sheep in the sun or gave it over to a deaf, mute, deranged person or minor, and it escaped and damaged, the owner is liable. But if he gave it over to a shepherd, the shepherd assumes responsibility for the animal in its place. So that section that is what we're doing now, this section here. Okay. Okay, guys. All right, so just to put it in a nutshell, Gav, tell me when you're coming back. Gav?
Sorry.
No problem. All right, so the Gemara returns to its analysis of our Mishnah. on 55b. And basically, if the sheep's fold was breached at night or robbers breached it, the owner of the sheep is not liable for any damage it does should it escape. Okay? So Rabba comments on this Mishnah's ruling. Rabba said, and it applies only where an animal dug under the wall. So the first case is understandable because if your sheep escapes and then does damage to other animals, then you're not responsible if somebody broke in your place and let the sheep out. That's obvious. The next part isn't so obvious. So that's why Rabba said it applies only when the animal dug under a wall. If its escape in that case is basically seen as an unforeseeable mishap, and the owner isn't responsible for that. Okay, because when the Mishnah ruled that the owner is exempt for damage caused by an animal that escaped at night, it refers to only an escape that took place in an unforeseeable manner. It's known as an ones. In other words, the animal excavated under the wall, causing it to fall. So what we're saying is, firstly, it has to be at night. If it escaped during the day, the owner is liable because he's meant to be looking after the animals. At night, he's entitled to get a bit of rest. Secondly, he should be at least asleep or have somebody watching it near the entrance of the door. So if you've got a sturdy fold, the only time that they could come in or out is through the latched pen. And in that case, somebody should be aware enough to where they see movement there to stop the animal from escaping. But you can't be expected to, if you've got this huge enclosure that's a half or quarter of a hectare, to be having eyes peeled all around it. So you've only got to be, or have somebody there by the entrance and exit gate. But if it escaped under a wall on the other side, it's not your responsibility, especially at night. Why not at night? Because you don't have to be awake. And number two, your neighbors wouldn't be alerted as to the fact that there's something unusual. So the Gemara is basically saying, okay, so it's challenging this teaching by Rabbah because it says, if it's seen as an unforeseeable mishap, which the owner is not responsible, how does this affect the implication? Because if it had not dug beneath the wall, in other words, the wall just fell on its own, what would the law be? That means that the owner is liable. Now, let's look at the circumstances. If you say that the Mishnah refers to a fold that has a sturdy wall, then where the animal had not dug beneath it, why would he be liable? In other words, because that's an unavoidable mishap, because he's not expected to have eyes peeled all around, and if it escaped underneath the wall at the opposite end of the enclosure, which might be maybe 200 or 300 meters across, then you're not liable. And it's a sturdy wall, meaning you've done everything to secure the area around so that it's not a place where the animal could escape. You never were to know that it dug underneath the soil, okay? Especially since sheep don't tend to do that. So there's nothing else he could have done to secure the animal, so he's not liable. But because what was his obligation? To build a sturdy enclosure. So the Mishnah says, look, it must be referring to a wall that's rickety within the fold. So when the animal dug beneath it, why is the owner exempt? It's saying that basically, if it's a rickety wall, then the owner should be liable. If it's a sturdy wall, the owner should not be liable. Why then, if it's a rickety wall, should the owner be exempt? Because it's a situation that began with negligence and ends with an unexpected mishap, where one is liable to pay. Okay? So I think you remember us dealing with this before. So in other words, the actual escape did occur in an unexpected manner, and honest. But since the owner had acted negligently, Bashir, in the first place, by leaving his animal in a rickety enclosure, he should be liable. Now, I don't know if you remember that we discussed this before. Like, do you remember when we talked about a pit cover? And we said that if it happens that it's not sturdy enough for sheep or oxen, but, okay, so it's sturdy enough for oxen, but not for camels, right? And the thing of it is, an ox fell through. But the reason it fell through was because of the worminess of the wood. It had nothing to do with the fact that it was not sturdy enough for camels. So the one side of the argument said, look, if there's another issue that caused the damage to the cover, even though you were negligent in one regard, it has nothing to do with where the reason the actual damage took place. And therefore, why should you be liable if the reason that the cover was faulty had nothing to do with your negligence? Gav, what have I just said here? Please repeat.
I'm calling this insect here, sorry, on the wall here. I'm a bit scared of it, sorry. You're talking about the rickety fence and whether you liable or not. If the rickety fence is put up, even if something unforeseen happens.
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat the last sentence. Insects are scary. I don't mind repeating the last sentence.
Sorry, it's quite a big thing that keeps their bone out now. That's why, sorry, I panicked a bit.
No, that's okay. Listen, anything with less than 2 legs, if it's got no legs at all, you should kill it. It's a snake. And if it's got more than 4 legs, it's an insect. You should kill it. So I agree with you. So, and I always err on the side of if you don't know if it's toxic, beat it to death and then figure it out. I'm not going to wait and figure out if it's toxic.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like
especially
spiders,
if it's got 8 legs, it's dead. It's dead.
Yeah.
So, Gav, this is what I'm saying. We did this before in a previous stuff about liability for a cover. So in that case, we said, look, it's good for oxen, but it's not good enough for camels. But what actually ended up happening is the oxen fell through, and the reason it fell through is because it got infected with worminess. The wood became rotten. So the one halachic opinion is that you're not liable because just because you should have made it strong enough for camels and you didn't, you can't make the person liable if the worminess was the reason that weakened the cover so that oxen fell in. Okay, at the end of the day. And the other opinion is the minute you are negligent in one regard, in other words, it should have been good enough for oxen, but it wasn't, and worminess caused the oxen to fall in, you're liable because it's just, you've opened yourself up to, you're not allowed legal protection when you've been so flagrant with the law. It's equivalent to a habitual offender, that if a first time a person got a ticket, you're willing maybe just to say, listen, here's a small ticket, or you're off the hook or whatever. But if you find out as a traffic officer that the guy's got 100 outstanding fines and the minute you drive away, tears it up, you're going to take him to jail because he just has no respect for the law. So the one opinion is the minute you are negligent in one regard, you're legally not entitled to be covered in another regard. So that's where the statement comes. It starts off with negligence and ends in an unexpected mishap. So we want to know, are you liable in this case? Which opinion do you hold by? Because if the wall is sturdy, then you should be exempt. If the wall is rickety, you should be liable. So what does it have to do with the fact of the animal burrowing under? If it burrows under and the wall collapses on top of it, you should be liable. If it burrows under but the wall is sturdy, you shouldn't be liable. Okay, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Why? Because the Rishonim explain that one is liable in this type of situation only if the negligence allowed, this is the general opinion, guys, the unexpected mishap to take place. In other words, in our case, the owner is liable if the rickety wall actually enabled the escape, because, in other words, it wasn't secure and the animal managed to break through because it wasn't a solid structure. But if he burrowed a tunnel under the wall, that escape has nothing to do with the quality of the wall. They're two separate issues. Does that make sense? It depends how the animal escaped. In other words, was the rickety wall a reason that it could break the fold by lack of security, or did it burrow under where it had no particular influence at all? That's the case that we're dealing with at the moment. So the Gemara now provides a partial solution and says, okay, it's fine according to the one who says that in a situation which begins with negligence and ends with an unexpected mishap, one is not liable to pay. Okay? In other words, because in the final analysis, the mishap couldn't have been anticipated. So this is a whole argument in Bava Kamma 42a, and there's two opinions on Rav Yosef. So that's where it discusses it. But according to the opinions that say that in a situation which begins with negligence and ends with an unexpected mishap, in that case, if you're liable to pay, what is there to say? So in other words, there is an opinion that even if an unexpected, even if the negligence has nothing to do with the unexpected mishap, you've opened yourself up legally and you have to pay. The other school of thought is that if it's negligence, but the unexpected mishap has nothing to do with the negligence per se, then you're not liable. So you're saying, okay, so if you're not liable in that case, even though you caused negligence and the wall's rickety, but the animal burrowed through the soil anyway, and it didn't get to escape through the rickety fence, you're fine. But if you're saying that any sort of mishap to the fence because you were liable and that fence should have been torn down, you're liable if the animal escapes because you now have lost your, your legal coverage. What do you say in that case? So the Gemara therefore now reinterprets Rabba's statement. Our Mishnah now refers to a fold that has a sturdy wall, and the owner is exempt even if the animal did not dig beneath it. Okay? Now, in other words, even if the animal escaped in a more conventional manner than digging, in other words, the wall collapsed and the animal walked over it, the owner is still exempt since it guarded it adequately by locking a sturdy enclosure. So in other words, if you've created a proper enclosure and the animal managed to, maybe there was a problem with the foundations, but your wall was sturdy. Maybe there was a soil issue, then you're off the hook. That's what it's saying. So the bottom line of it is, as long as you've done your part, you're legally off the hook. That's the bottom line from all of that. You're covered by both opinions. Gavin, remember we dealt with this case where two people were walking with a beam. One person was walking with a beam and another one had a pot plant. And the person accidentally fell. And as he fell, he turned around and said, stop. And he gave adequate warning. Do you remember that case? Kev, you remember? In that case, even though he was to blame, by shouting an adequate warning, he was covered. Does that make sense? So you've got to cover yourself and also. And when Rabba's teaching was stated, it was stated in regard to the other clause in the Mishnah. In other words, not this one with the robber and the escaping animal. It's saying if he left the sheep in the sun or gave it over to a deaf mute, a deranged person or a minor, in other words, any mentally incompetent person that couldn't see the future consequences of the actions, and it escaped and damaged, he's liable, obviously. So in explanation of this ruling, Rabba said, he is liable even if the animal dug beneath the wall. So what it's basically saying there is, if the wall was sturdy, he's still responsible. Why? And the reason being is that if you leave an animal in the sun, generally an animal like a sheep is calm, but if its brain gets cooked and it gets sunstroke, it's going to behave like a carrion animal, and it's going to try and escape in the most aggressive way possible. And therefore, by leaving it in the sun, you might have created a sturdy wall, but you've created a wild animal, and therefore you're negligent. And obviously, if you give it to somebody that's an idiot or does it or can't function properly, then you're liable. Because what are you doing giving it to somebody that has no care or responsibility and has all their faculties? Either way, you're liable. Because that's entirely negligence. Okay. So in that particular way, you're not off the hook. Rather, you're liable even when it dug beneath the wall, which is completely unexpected. Because you might have argued and said he should be exempt in this case, because it's a situation that began with negligence and ends with an unavoidable mishap. Meaning, you might have thought that although animals do virtually anything to escape the heat of the sun, it's not likely that a sheep will actually dig its way out. It's not a dog. So if it does escape, it should be treated as an unexpected mishap, an ones. But this would be a situation that begins with negligence. In other words, you left it cooking in the sun and it got, a sunstroke, or you didn't close the enclosure properly, and it ended with an unexpected mishap. So that way, there is liability in that situation. Okay? So Rabbah therefore informs us that it's entirely negligent, even if the animal escaped in an unusual way, and it's not seen as an unavoidable mishap, bottom line, if you were involved with any sort of thing that could have contributed to that sort of negligence, even indirectly. Because the victim can claim to the owner, you knew that you left your animal in the sun. It went mad. Any tactic that it could do to escape, it would do an escape. So now your sheep escaped and he damaged me. You can expect it even to act like a dog and dig its way out. So therefore, it's not an unexpected mishap. It was your negligence that caused the animal to act erratically. So the next part of the Mishnah states, let's see how long we've got. We're doing well. If robbers took the animal out of its enclosure, the robbers are liable for any damage it subsequently does. So the Gemara says, this is obvious. Since the robbers removed the animal from the owner's domain, it's considered to be in possession of theirs in every regard. So what do we mean? Obviously, if the robbers pulled out the animal, that's an act of mashicha, okay? What's mashicha? It literally is an act of pulling. So that's one of the formal modes of acquisition. It's a kinyan. Okay, so when you pull the animal towards you, or you push an animal, or you do a physical act of lifting it up, that's an acquisition. So you might say, how can you if you don't have permission to own it and you're stealing the animal, or you're touching the animal and it's not yours, how could you literally acquire it? You don't own it. So we're saying, no, you don't acquire it in the sense as though you bought it, but you acquire responsibility for it. So once a thief has performed a kinyan with the object he's stealing, he's taken it out of the physical domain, he is responsible for two things: the animal that is damaged and any damage the animal does. That's according to Rashi and Tosfot. Okay, so we're saying that that's obvious. That's a direct contact. It's not groma. So the Gemara now says, well, then why did the Mishnah have to teach it's responsible for the damage it causes? So it says it's needed only where they stood in front of the animal. In other words, the robbers actually blocked its passage on all sides except for one, and therefore they steered it in that direction without actually pulling it. In other words, maybe you can take a different case that's mentioned by Rashi, is that if you direct an animal by kind of like blocking off its options towards somebody's food and the animal eats, it's as though you led it and made it eat. It's a transgression of shame. And that even is an issue that might apply in the public domain, because we know for shame and regular you exempt in the public domain. But that's when the animal of its own volition in the normal walking and movement might eat something. But when you have to do with the fact that it's eating somebody else's produce that they're selling in the public domain, many sources say that you're not exempt under shame in that case, and you're liable. Okay. Now, the Gemara actually elaborates on this, and it says, look, our Mishnah teaches the same ruling that which Rabbah said in the name of Rav Masna, who said in the name of Rav, one who stands his fellow's animal and his fellow standing grain is liable for the damage it does there. And the following objection was raised by Rav Masna's teaching, but if he stood the animal over his fellow's grain, it is obvious that he's liable. So what it's saying is, look, the original source of this wasn't when you cornered the animal and it only had one route to escape when you broke in as a robber. It's saying that the actual case itself was when you forced an animal into a direction to make it eat, where there was grain available, Whereas if you gave it complete choice, it would be the animal's responsibility if he ate the grain of another, okay? Because it blocked the passage for all other directions. And therefore, although it's not direct, it's considered direct enough to not be indirect act of damage. It's not groma. Okay, that's what they're saying. So there's a second explanation of Rav Masna's teaching, which says, Abaya said to Rav Yosef, you told us that Rav Masna refers to where the perpetrator struck the animal. And hence the Mishnah's clause about robbers as well could be referred to where they struck the animal. So it doesn't mean you have to make the physical act kinyan of mashicha, meaning you pull in the animal. If you beat the animal is definitely going to go in a certain direction. That's enough of an acquisition, meaning you've influenced its course of direction to escape or to eat something that didn't belong to him, and therefore it's as if you've made that acquisition. So whether it's psychological, that you cornered the animal, that it had no escape route, you beat it with the stick or you pulled it, all of those are considered acts of acquisition. Okay? So then the robbers would be liable. So the Mishnah taught something else now. If he gave over the sheep to a shepherd, the shepherd assumes responsibility for it in its place. Okay? In other words, I'm the owner, and I gave it to a shepherd to look after. So we're saying, okay, now the shepherd's an expert. He should assume responsibility. So the Gemara says, whose place does the shepherd take? If you say that he takes the place of the animal's owner, we've already learned this before. So where did we learn it, guys? In Mishnah 44b. Okay? Yeah, in other words, I own a sheep. I say, I'm going down to Durban, look after the sheep, and I give it to a shepherd. Okay, to look after. The guy's an expert. That was in the 44th daf. So he's competent to look after the sheep. It's off my hands. So the Gemara is saying, well, why learn it again? We learned it in 44b. Why are we learning it in 55b?
Is it?
So
is he like a paid custodian? Sorry, because he's an expert. Even though he didn't take payment for it.
So that's exactly what it's going to bring up. Well done, Kev. You've done the work. So if the owner of the animal entrusted it to an unpaid shomer, a borrower, a paid shomer, or a renter, they all take the place of an owner. In other words, if that's the intent of the Mishnah, it would be redundant, exactly as Kevin says. What does the Mishnah mean by saying in his place? So exactly as Kevin said, like, what is a shepherd? It's actually a custodian. So either the shepherd's doing you a favor and you're not paying him, and you say, listen, you know sheep, you're looking after others, I'm going to Durban, look after the sheep, or you pay him. Or it's a shepherd that wants to borrow the sheep for whatever reason, maybe needs a fur coat, who knows? So the Gemara is saying, what's this term in his place? So what it means is that the shepherd takes the place of a watchman. In other words, the Mishnah refers to a case where the owner had given over the sheep to one watchman, who then gave it over to another watchman, the shepherd. So the Mishnah teaches, just as the first watchman had assumed full responsibility for the animal, so does the second. In other words, I know my sheep. I go to Durban, I give it to Kevin. Now, Kevin all of a sudden realizes he's got to go back to Israel. So Kevin calls Gavin. He says, I know you know sheep well. I'm going to give you Damon sheep to look after. So the Gemara is saying, I made Kevin entrusted for it. And when Kevin gives it over to Gavin, Gavin's assuming responsibility as the second custodian for it. Okay? Now, so in other words, I come back, I say to Kevin, well, what happened on the phone? And Kevin says, no, speak to Gavin. I gave it to him. I've got nothing to do with it. So basically, the Mishnah interprets it as holding the second watchman liable, not only for the damage done by the animal, but also for the damage done to the animal. So in other words, if Kevin's given it to Gavin, if the animal's created any drama, Gavin's responsible for that. If the animal gets injured, Gavin's responsible for that. And if you say that's not fair, well, then Gavin should have said to Kevin, according to the Mishnah so far, I want nothing to do with your sheep. Give it to somebody else. Either I don't want the money or I won't take the responsibility. Okay. Now, the Gemara now asks the question. It says, hang on a second. The first watchman is completely exempt. So shall we say that this is a refutation of Rava? Because remember, guys, we learned that Rava said, if one custodian transferred a deposit to another custodian, the first custodian is liable to pay for any loss. Do you remember the reason, guys?
Yeah, because you vetted. You know that first guy that you've given it to. You don't know the second guy that he's like subletting it to.
Excellent. That's exactly it. I can turn around to Kevin and say, Kevin, I know you. I trusted you. I don't know this Gavin guy. I don't know if he can do an oath before the base den, because I don't know his track record. I don't believe what he has to say. I believe you. That's why I trusted you. So I'm not holding him responsible. You never told me. I'm holding you responsible, exactly as Gavin said. So, well done, Gavin. Good memory. So Rava's opinion is defended. Rava would say to you in defense, what does the Mishnah mean when he says he gave it over to the shepherd? It means that he submitted it to his apprentice. In other words, the first watchman was an expert shepherd who gave over the animal to his apprentice to watch. In that case, even Rava would agree that the first shepherd is exempt because it's the way of shepherds to give over his charge to his apprentice. Okay. I don't know about animal husbandry, so it's difficult to understand. But basically, the owner would expect the shepherd he appointed to trust his sheep to an apprentice. And then even according to Rava, the owner cannot refuse to accept the apprentice's oath. So I've got a business where I'm a shepherd and I have shepherds working for me. Okay? And then one of the guys working for me says it disappeared. So now I want to take a polygraph test. You can accept that I've got a business with employees. It's not some random oak I chose. He works for me. He doesn't want to lose his job. You see, the case with Kevin and Gavin was different because Gavin doesn't lose anything. He gains a sheep if he's lying, if he's telling the truth. So, okay, he's telling the truth, but he's not dependent upon his employer for a salary. When a person is put in charge as an employee for something, he doesn't want to lose his job over this. So you can trust he doesn't want to lose his job and that a company has employees. So that if that employee makes an oath using Hashem's name and he doesn't want to lose his job or whatever, you've got to trust that when you take it to a company, you trust their staff to look after it. Otherwise, you've chosen the wrong company. So you've got to take it as face value and accept the second person's oath if he's an employee or a shepherd's apprentice. Otherwise, don't choose that company to look after your animal. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Right, just one more point, and then we're done. We've got 5 minutes left. We're almost done. So there's another version of the previous discussion. You could say it this way. There are those who say that this discussion ran as follows, okay? The Mishnah stated he gave it over to a shepherd, and he did not state the more general phrase he gave it over to another. Learn from here that what does the Mishnah mean when he says he gave it over to a shepherd? It means that a shepherd gave it over to his apprentice because it is the way of a shepherd to give over his charge to his apprentice. But if he had given them to another person, the same law would not apply. Rather, the first watchman would be liable. Shall we say that this supports Rava? For Rava said if one custodian transferred a deposit to another custodian, he, the first custodian, is liable to pay for any loss. Okay? The Gemara deflects this proof. It says it's not a valid proof because the Mishnah might have chosen to state the typical case where an expert shepherd gives over the charge to an apprentice, but the same law would apply when he gave it over to someone else, meaning that basically the Gemara accepts the Mishnah's ruling that the second watchman is liable. regarding a case where the first watchman was an expert shepherd, gave it over to his apprentice, but it doesn't apply if the animal was transferred to anybody else. Okay? This, in other words, the reason the Mishnah mentioned the case of an apprentice wasn't for halachic significance, but because it's the most common instance of one watchman transferring it to the safekeeping of another. Okay, so I must be honest with you, I prefer the first way it's said. It sounds a lot clearer. I don't know what you think. All right, guys, we're done. We still have 3 minutes to spare.
Yeah, I just want to ask you something, Damon, before you. Yeah. I'll send you a message. I'll send a message. This year. So this paid custodian can't just transfer, or the custodian can't just give it to a third party, another one. And if there's damage, liability is with the one he transferred it to, or no, actually him, because he should have, because it's he didn't have permission from the owner to give it to a second.
It seems there's two separate cases. The one case is a case where I trusted you, Kevin, I know you. Then I go away, and then you know this other guy, but I don't know this other guy. Then I don't accept, if the sheep goes missing, I don't accept his oath because I don't have a track record of him. So therefore, you're responsible for giving it over to the second party because I only entrusted it to you. Now, it's different. It's a different case when you take it to you take it to the vet. So you take the animal to the vet, and the vet has got other veterinarians working for him. Does that make sense? Now, you've trusted that medical practice, that company, that institution. You trust the owner, and you trust the owner and his employees because you've chosen that service provider, which already has employees upon which you know are part of the practice. This is not a surprise to you. And therefore, if one of the assistant vets kills your animal, you have to accept their testimony because you chose the company with the owner and all its employees to look after your animal. So you have to accept that testimony. It's different to when I've entrusted only one person and that person gives over the responsibility to somebody else whom I don't know. It's different to when you choose a company where you've accepted upon yourself that you have to accept that company lock, stock, and barrel. I don't know if I'm making sense, guys.
If the company has to change, let's say just to give you another example, let's say that company, ABC, hands it over to XYZ company, then that's also a problem.
That's a total problem. Gavin's completely correct. That's completely correct. Or they sell it and there's new ownership immediately, and that wasn't the arrangement. Gavin is completely correct. Whether they gave it over to another party or ownership changed, or because that was not the situation that you signed up for. Absolutely right, Gavin.